the Humboldt State Forensics Spring Speaker Series for 2021. My name is Aaron Donaldson. I'm the Director of Forensics at Humboldt State. The term forensics has been invoked by American speech and debate educators like myself since the early 1900s via Aristotle to center the difficulties and consequences of public discourse. Tonight, after hopefully no more than 7 or 8 minutes of introduction from me, we will be asking whose futurities and critically exploring the politics and possibilities of science fiction and horror. We must begin, however, by acknowledging that we are streaming from the land of the Wiyot peoples, which includes the Wiyot tribe, Bear River Rancheria, and Blue Lake Rancheria. Arcata, where Humboldt State University is located, is known as Gudini, meaning over in the woods or among the redwoods. The persistence of the Wiyot peoples to remain in relationship with these lands compels us to spread awareness to our inner and extended community regarding the true history of this space. We strive to hold ourselves and others accountable for the continuation of colonial acts which neglect to include the voices and needs of those tribes while remembering to lead with compassion. I would add, echoing Dr. Risling-Baldi, who is on our panel tonight, that land acknowledgements such as this one are themselves often a problematic kind of posturing in that they claim to name and describe settler colonial practices of land theft with no real tangible effects. So we would like to emphasize and insist that everyone take meaningful time to reflect on their own land occupation and to find significant ways we can work to give the land back and to empower the indigenous communities whose lands we continue to occupy. I would like to next acknowledge the individuals and campus groups who have helped to make this event possible. They are Janessa Lund and the folks at Associated Students. In particular, thanks goes to Jordan Lamar, who has been emailing with me about this since October, and to Casey Park and Dan Perez-Sornia, who together helped plan, organize, fund, and stream this event. Thanks also to Amanda Nelson and the Department of Athletics for webinar assistance, and of course to the amazing students on the Humboldt State Forensics team interested in all the ways our communicating has consequence. This panel evolved out of an ongoing media strategy whereby members of our team over the past few years have researched and argued about the roles that settler colonial myth and media play in our understanding of reality and politics. Without the interest and work of students like Blue Baldwin, Eddie Carpenter, Devin Escoto, Sydney Verga, and several others on our team over the years, this panel probably would not have come together. If you are a student or a prospective student at Humboldt State and are interested in joining the speech and debate team and learning more, consider enrolling in COM 110 Intercollegiate Speech and Debate this fall. I would also like to thank you all for joining us during such an historic time. I've often remarked that one thing I miss more than I anticipated is being in an audience and sharing in the moments of discovery with invested and curious other people. I think we can all agree that this is not the same, but like me, I hope that you see real meaning in the communion that we can find. So thank you for being here. If you in the audience have a question for the panel, feel free to type it into the Q&A box down there at the bottom. You won't see it, but believe me, we can. The panelists might respond there, at which point it would show up for everyone along with their answer. They might take up that answer in their comments as they're making them, or we can bring the discussion from the Q&A into the conversation itself. Please do understand if we don't get to all the good questions tonight because we have so many that the panelists have already been considering via email in the run-up to this event. At last, of course, thank you to our 3 distinguished scholars for your willingness to make the time to discuss these vivid and important themes and for the important work that they have all collectively contributed within their respective fields. A brief introduction of our panel, followed by 10 to 20 minutes of opening remarks from each of them in the order that they are introduced, and then we'll spend the remainder of the time tonight fielding some questions. The first guest that I would really like to introduce is Dr. Bernadette Marie Calafell. Dr. Calafell got her PhD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and is currently a professor and chair of critical race and ethnic studies at Gonzaga University. She is editor of the Journal of International and Intercultural Communication. She has co-edited 4 books, including this one, De-Whitening Communication, Intersectionality, De-Whitening Intersectionality, Race, Intercultural Communication, and Politics. And I cannot recommend this enough, especially to white scholars doing intersectional research. She has authored 2 books, Latino Communication Studies, Theorizing Performance, and this text, Monstrosity, Performance, and Race in Contemporary Culture, which I must add my students and I have really enjoyed over the years. I'm not going to spoil it. It has one of the best dedications I've ever seen. Just a really great book. Dr. Calafell has originally planned to talk tonight about science fiction and horror as alternative possibilities and futures for Black folks, Indigenous people, and people of color, with a special focus on Black, queer feminists, and Latinx communities. Welcome, Dr. Calafell. Thank you very much for being here. Next is Dr. Cutcha Risling-Baldy. Dr. Risling-Baldi is an associate professor and department chair of Native American Studies at Humboldt State and co-founder of the Native Women's Collective, a nonprofit supporting the revitalization of Native American arts and culture. She researches indigenous feminisms, California Indians, and decolonization. She is author of We Are Dancing for You, Native Feminisms and the Revitalization of Women's Coming of Age Ceremonies. This book was published by the University of Washington Press and received the award for Best First Book in Native American and Indigenous Studies at the 2019 Native American Indigenous Studies Association Conference. Here, too, I have to echo the voices of numerous students that I've read this text with in my gender communication over the years, saying that it is really essential and informative reading. Dr. Risling-Baldi is Hoopa, Karuk, and Yurok, and enrolled in the Hoopa Valley tribe, and said she originally planned to talk tonight about settler colonialism and post-apocalypse narrative in Native American literature and beyond, and also the ways indigenous futurities imagined beyond settler colonialism and capitalism. Dr. Risling-Baldi, thank you very much for being here tonight. And our third distinguished scholar is Dr. Michael Lechuga. Dr. Lechuga researches and teaches culture, settler colonial studies, Latina, Latino, Latinx studies, and rhetoric as an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico. I cannot wave his first book at you yet because it comes out at the end of this year or the beginning of next year, he says, via the University of Mississippi Press. It will be titled Alien Affects, Trafficking Technologies of Visibility Through the Settler Citizenship Assemblage. And in it, Lechuga illuminates the complex relationships between Hollywood, alien invasion film industries, and the technologies used to securitize the Mexico-US border. The book explores how settler colonial logics persist in border security mechanisms that subject migrant communities to violence, imprisonment, and death. In general, his research focuses on the role that technology, language, and media play in organizing settler colonial logics in the United States and how alienhood is mapped onto bodies through contemporary media and surveillance practices. Dr. Lechuga, thank you very much for taking the time to be here tonight. Dr. Calafell, we would like to begin with you. Thank you very much for taking the time. Would you like to share with us some of your prior or current research interests on these themes?
Sure. Thank you, first of all, Dr. Donaldson and my co-panelists, as well as everyone who's put this together, for hosting this panel and inviting me to be a part of it. I'm just going to talk kind of extemporaneously about some of the work I've done and give you a context of who I am and how I come to this space. So as you heard, my PhD is in communication studies with a specific focus on performance studies. And I think of myself as a critical cultural studies scholar. As you heard, I currently reside in the Department of Critical Race and Ethnic Studies, which fits my longstanding commitment to understanding meanings around race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability, as well as how we take an activist approach or stance in our work. Most recently, the work I'm most interested in is at the intersections of Chicana futurism and horror. And so that's kind of how I see myself coming to this conversation. And, you know, I wear a lot of hats in my professional life. And one of the roles I take is not just as I do a lot of critical qualitative research as a way to understand monstrosity, but I also study popular culture. And so that's where I come into the study of monstrosity and horror. And anyone who knows me, and my mom can tell you that I've always been fascinated by monsters, specifically by werewolves or shapeshifters, ever since I was a little girl. Growing up in South Phoenix, one of the stories, as well as growing up Chicana in South Phoenix, one of the stories I heard often was the story of La Llorona, you know, the weeping woman who will take you in as a sacrifice as one of her children so she can, you know, get into heaven or the afterlife, right? She's trying to find her lost children that she murdered. So I've always been interested in these kinds of stories. And one of the things that I've been fascinated by is how monsters and horror can hold possibilities for us, as well as, especially for those of us who are from historically marginalized communities, as well as they can be spaces that are used against us or oppressive. So I'm always interested in those kinds of two possibilities of monstrosity. And so a lot of my work is centered around the idea of what the monster signifies. What does the monster mean in this particular moment or context? And I teach a course, I've taught it at the University of Denver. I'm currently teaching it right now at Gonzaga University on monsters in popular culture. And what we do is we look at how different monsters shift their meanings over time, right? So what do werewolves signify in the 80s versus in the 90s or the 2000s? Why is Godzilla, a monster of the nuclear war, suddenly popular again now, right? These are the kind of questions that we talk about as well in the course. So that's kind of my research and pedagogical approach. And Dr. Donaldson reminded me, because I was making a list earlier in preparation of all of the work that I've done around sci-fi and horror. And he reminded me that I had written about Star Wars and I had forgotten completely about it. I don't know why I didn't think about it, because probably Star Wars was my first the way that I learned to love sci-fi, right? And so one of the first projects that I've written was with a colleague of mine, Dr. Joshua Atkinson, on hegemonic masculinity at the gray area in the Star Wars universe through the character of Anakin Skywalker / Darth Vader, not to spoil it for you if you haven't seen it. There's been plenty of time. And so looking at how this idea of the gray area lets, white masculinity continue to perpetuate violence, right? And so that was one of the first projects that really got me into doing work on sci-fi. But as I moved throughout my career, I began to be more interested in issues around feminism and horror. And so is it a contradiction to talk about feminist horror? Are there possibilities associated with feminist horror, right? And that was kind of one of the driving questions that led to me teaching a special class a few times on feminist horror, right? And so when I was doing this work on feminist horror, it led me to two films, American Mary by Rob Zombie and The Lords of Salem by the Soska sisters, to demonstrate what I have seen as these what I term post-feminist nightmares, in which women continue to be subjected to patriarchal rule through a so-called feminist politics predicated on individual agency. And so, I've been really fascinated by the possibilities of feminist horror, as well as, what constitutes feminist horror. And that question led me to the next project that I continued on with Dr. Shadi Abdi. And we wrote about the Iranian spaghetti Western film, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. And this is a beautiful film, black and white film by Lily Amapir, who to think about how the film creates what we term queer utopias and offers this monstrous feminist vampire as a heroine. And she's wearing a chador, which challenges Western feminist constructions of Middle East and North African women who choose to wear the chador, right? And so really starting to think about what does feminist horror mean beyond traditional approaches to feminist horror, which I'll mention later, have traditionally been really focused on psychoanalytic approaches. And then my next project was co-authored with Kendall Phillips, and it focused on the film The Devil Doll, which is a very old film, and explored the role of extra textual elements in the film and the disciplining of the feminine and disabled body, right? So once again, thinking about how identity plays out and how identity is a site of contestation and horror. My most recent publication focused on the film Get Out and the erasure of Black queer femme figures, particularly the figure of Georgina, who is the woman who is positioned as she works for the family, but we come to find out she is actually grandma, right? And one of the things that I'm asking is, what radical possibilities do we ignore through her representation? And because we once again focus on a narrative of Blackness that equates it with maleness, right? And likewise, what does Georgina's so-called passivity and complicity mean for representations of Black queer women? And so with this project, one of the things that I ventured into is taking more of an Afrofuturist approach to this work, and really going back to the feminist roots of Afrofuturism. So that just came out recently. more recently, and Michael knows about this because he has heard this and had to watch this film, or chose to kindly watch the film and give feedback as well, is a project I've been working on in a short independent horror film called Elegante, which also was a comic book. And takes place at the US-Mexico border and uses the metaphor of cannibalism to talk about not only the tensions and governmental actions against Mexicanos by white supremacy, but how Chicanos, Chicanas, and Chicanx peoples also participate in white supremacy at the border. And that piece is right now in revision. It's going to be in a book on transnationalism and communication. So that's where I'm still working on, and I'm happy to talk about that project if people have questions or anything about that. But that's kind of what I'm been working on. And then finally, I'm in the early stages of an essay on Rob Zombie's The Devil's Rejects. I can't say much, but again, I return to the question of feminist representation. And when you hear the name Rob Zombie, you don't immediately think feminist representation, but I'm very interested in the character of Baby Firefly, who also played the character in The Lords of Salem, or the woman, Sherry Moon Zombie, also played the character in The Lords of Salem. So these are some of the things that I'm thinking about. So I guess you could say my work comes down to the question of what are the possibilities of representation within horror and monstrosity, particularly for those from historically marginalized groups. How can horror be a site of possibility and resistance? How can we think about the relationship of horror and sci-fi to the body? What does it mean to take a feminist lens to horror, a place that has center that intersectionally, right? Center feminist lens intersectionally, and move beyond a psychoanalytic or more traditional perspective, right? These are the kinds of questions that animate the work that I've been doing in horror and sci-fi. And so that's my spiel, and I'm happy to talk and give more whatever anyone needs or doesn't need later on. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Calafell. Really appreciate those remarks. Dr. Risling-Baldi, you're up next. We'd love to hear what you're working on and what you have on these themes.
Thanks, everyone. It's really great to be here, and it's kind of interesting because I love nerding out in this way, especially because a lot of what happens to me in my own life is I will go into a situation and like I'll go to the movies with my husband and I'll be sitting there and he'll be like, "What did you think?" And I'll be like, from a like Foucauldian power analysis perspective of what just happened in this situation, like we should talk about what's going on, like with the like what's happening between these characters, and he'll go, "No, that was the Avengers. Like, can't we just watch the Avengers?" And I'm like, "No, because this is really about like the fallacy of scarcity and like the ways in which capitalism is trying to convince us." Like, and he'll go, "No, no, no, that was because Iron Man just had an opinion." And I'll be like, "No, no, no, see," and so I like coming to spaces where I can be like, "Everybody, let's talk about what's really going on here." So I think that where we can create our nerding out spaces of being able to be like, what's really happening in these discourses helps me to kind of feel a little bit like, okay, once we are talking about this, then what does that mean for how we then can understand what it means then to center our own voices in these moments of what it means to create science fiction and horror. I ask these questions all the time. Like I actually teach an Indigenous comic books. I teach an Indigenous science fiction and comics books course. And however many times people are telling me like, they'll sign up for the course and be like, "I didn't even know there was Indigenous comic books and science fiction," right? And then I'll go, "No, we're like the OG science fiction people. Like that's what we were doing. Like we were imagining worlds beyond worlds. We were building futures beyond futures. We were like demonstrating like what it means to think about from like theoretical perspectives the impacts of the decisions that we were making, and we were theorizing that. So of course we were doing that, and now we're doing it now in really meaningful ways." I think that the research that that I do when it comes to like pop culture is really it's more for me not an academic pursuit, but just sort of that a lot of the times when you're a Native person and you watch TV or movies, When you see another Native person on TV or movies, you're like, Indian, and then you get really excited, and then you tell everybody, and then you want to talk about it because we just don't see ourselves a lot imagined in these spaces. And so when it happens, that you want to tell people about why that's so important. We did that with Twilight. That's actually one of my most, like, my best references to that. When I went to see Twilight in the theater, which I'll admit to, it was actually primarily in our region, just because we're fortunate enough to live in a region with lots of Indian people. It was primarily a lot of Indian women in this theater that I was in, and none of us were Team Edward, of course. We were all Team Jacob, which was weird because everybody else in the theater is, of course, like Edward, whatever. And we were like, bring on the werewolves. But because we like seeing Indian people doing things and like being in these imaginatory spaces, because we're always sort of only imagined in the past and never really imagined as present or in the future. And now what you're seeing is like a real like renaissance of people who are thinking, what does it mean when the marginalized voices write science fiction, write horror, and push forward stories? They're informed in a different way. They carry a different message. They actually have a different sort of basis and foundation, I think, for what they're trying to do. And I think a lot in my own work about like, what does it mean to read and write and be represented in a science fiction where the fiction part of it is actually like a repeated history. And so what we're actually talking about is, I always say, there's this constant settler colonial fear of what will happen post-capitalism and settler colonialism, because in their mind, it can only be dystopia, because this is the system that has been set up by this large group of people to actually oppress other peoples. And so to them, dystopia only exists beyond capitalism and beyond settler colonialism. But for us, it's liberation. And so when you start talking about the downfall of systems, how do you also start talking about these sort of like uplifting of liberatory imagination and voices? And what does it also mean that that repeated history has been so silenced? So when you start looking at the way that things are portrayed in science fiction, a lot of the times I will watch it with some of like my parents or my elders, and they'll go, yeah, that actually happened. Like that already happened to our people. Like that's actually what they did. One of the most recent examples was The Handmaid's Tale. I was watching The Handmaid's Tale with my mother, and she was like, you realize that's just what they did to California Indian women when they enslaved us in the 1800s. It was just that. So you're like, and out of context of that historical context, it feels like a dystopian future, but in fact, it's an actual repeated historical past that people are imagining as if it's just this first thing that ever happened. And then we only care about it because it's centering primarily like a white protagonist, when in fact, this is what's been happening to women of color in multiple spaces. So our imagined futures and dystopic like visions are very different and based on very different things. I also think about what it means for Native people to think about science fiction and horror, but especially like science fiction and futurities in the context of the fact that we are the survivors of genocide, that we are sort of like post-apocalypse. We have seen the end of the world. So a lot of California Indians, like when we talk about colonization, we will refer to it as invasion, not as colonization, and then we'll say it was the end of the world. That's what we call it, the end of the world. So we are now post-apocalypse. And when you look at us as sort of being the examples of what it means to be post-apocalypse, it's one of the reasons why I tell people, so how soon after the apocalypse do you start telling people, why are you still talking about the apocalypse? Why are you still bringing this up? Why do you still hang on to this? Like how many years until you're like, hey, could you just let it go? Right? Like it was just the apocalypse. And it's not like, and so we are actually the post-apocalyptic example of like what this means, what it means to recover, what it means to like carry that in your DNA, what it means to understand what the horrors of settler colonialism truly are. Our imagined horrors are very different, I think, than the imagined horrors of people who without the context of settler colonialism can't imagine that this has already happened to our people and is continuing to happen to this day. It's like our bodies that are constantly the ones that are put on display, that are tortured, that are put like into positions where you watch us, you know, you watch people of color being killed in real life on television. You watch it being recorded, and then you act as if this is like some kind of dystopic future, but it's happening right now. So I think in the context of that, you see that our science fiction, our horror, I think is a little bit different. The imaginings of a dystopic future that then is made salient for us because of our historical memory and our epigenetic markers. And I really look at it that way when I start watching the things that are coming out. I just start going like, oh, this is a very particular story told by a very particular group of people. My favorite thing to talk about is that when I was younger, we weren't allowed to watch TV during dinner. That was like the one rule. My mom was like, during dinner, you can't watch television. Television can't be on except when it was Star Trek. If it was Star Trek, she would let us watch TV during dinner because she didn't want to miss Star Trek. And I was very shaped by all the Star Treks, the like oldest one all the way through the next generation. Captain Janeway is the best captain, actually. So if anybody wants to know where I fall, that's it. She's the best. Everybody else is gonna suck it, right? Picard is like so moody. And you just want to be like, get over yourself, man. Like, you're the captain. Like, you should be happy about it. And Kirk is arrogant. But there's this like really great episode. Well, there's a lot of great episodes, but there's this great episode of the old Star Trek I remember watching when I was really young, where they go to this planet that has like Indians on it. And Kirk actually goes native and he falls in love with this native woman and decides he's going to stay with her. And he's like living with her and doing stuff with her. And then he wakes up one day and he's like, look, we got to like improve this culture and society. And she's like, okay. And he says, so what I'm going to do is we're going to go out, we're going to build a dam. And that's what's going to like start this culture moving forward. And I was like, see, that's the problem, because that's the imagination of white dudes writing science fiction. It's now we're at this point where like all we're doing is fighting to take dams down because some white guy at some point was like, build a dam, nothing, what's going to go wrong there? So it really kind of shaped my understanding of how I understand like what's the the liberatory imagination that we could have when it comes to these moments. And I thought a lot about this as I was like, I have responses like every movie that's ever been written where I was like, well, from a Native perspective, like that's really messed up what just happened there, right? So there's this great one called Cowboys and Aliens. I love that one. And the reason why is I always wanted to be like, must suck, right? The threat that someone's going to show up at your door someday and take all your land and not ask you about it and just kill you. That must be real hard. And then I was like, watch, the aliens are going to show up. They're going to make treaties with you. They're going to promise they're going to treat you good. But you know deep down, they're just going to kill all of you and you don't like it. And I was like, so it must be hard. Like that must be really difficult for you. Like to think about like the different things that are happening. I always said for me, science fiction was a way of settlers reconciling what had happened, like what they did, and being really fearful that it would happen to them, which is why they could only ever imagine aliens as colonizers. And in my mind, that would never be the case, because if we assume that there's some kind of advancement that comes from technology and technological growth, then that means in my mind, they would show up and they would be like, you think we're here to take all your resources and enslave you? Like, isn't that the most primitive thing you've ever heard of? Like, colonization's so primitive. Like, why would we do that? And we just assume they would come and try to like do the same thing. That's how you get Independence Day and all these other things, right? Because it's them with their fear, trying to like reconcile their fear and also justify that settler colonialism is natural, that it sort of is how all societies function, which is not true. Which brings me to my latest favorite, greatest film about this. It's a film called Arrival. And what I love about this film is the way that it makes fun of the assumption that aliens are going to try to colonize us. And that the hero of this film is a linguist who is trying to tell people like, no, we have to figure out how to, because what if they're here to help us or what? And in the end they are, and then everybody wants to shoot nukes at them. And I just thought, this is it. This is the sort of moment where we can start having a conversation about what's the imagination beyond that colonialism is natural, that we're all fighting for our lives, that everybody wants to take resources, or even that the imagination of the peoples, the most marginalized peoples, aren't the ones that are going to have the ways that we're supposed to move forward beyond this idea that like this is what society has to look like. I most recently have read and reread, and I highly recommend this for this period of time right now. Everybody should be reading and rereading Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. Those are the two ways I think that we start to see how Black feminist thinkers have been able to intervene on what science fiction can do, what it's supposed to do, and like what we can imagine for our futures. And the reason I particularly loved it, right, like when I reread it this time, because I'm doing so much work right now in food sovereignty, is that at the heart of this book, the thing that's going to save the people is acorns, and that the growth of oak trees and acorns is going to save humanity in the end. And that to me was really important because California Indians, we call ourselves, in Hoopa, we call ourselves Kunyat. That's how we say, like, I'm a person, I'm a human being. But what it actually means is I'm an acorn eater. And that's because we said if you wanted to be a human being, you had to eat acorns. Acorns are what sustained us. They're what built us. They're what made us. They're still here for us. They are the thing that remind us of the care that it takes to live in this world. And in the end, in this book, what they're talking about is like, while they tried to take all of that away and they tried to kill all the oak trees and they tried, in the end, that's the thing. That's the way we move forward. And that's how I see Indigenous futurities and Afrofuturisms and these things coming together to say, it's like it's our liberatory imagination that's going to move this next world. It's going to build this next world because we, as the colonized, as the marginalized in this space, we are the ones who represent that liberatory imagination. We know the time before colonialism. We have stories about it. We lived it. We know this place before colonialism. We know that it's possible. So we also know the time and represent the time after colonialism, because we also know that in the grand scheme of our 10,000 years of being here in this space, this settler colonial space is teeny tiny. And when it's done, it's going to be our like liberatory imaginations that build that. And that's what I think we do when we do science fiction, when we write these stories for ourselves. So I'll end there.
I really appreciate it. I'm going to share the Nerds of Color blog that I always share. It's such a wonderful example of what you were talking about. Dr. Risling-Baldi has written Why I Teach The Walking Dead during my Native Studies class and talks about how Carl is her grandfather and how can we get over this. This is that moment of just resituating, the science fiction past and future. Just a great read for folks that are interested. Some folks are asking for like lists of books and films. The books that these folks have written are on the posters, so you can take a look at that. I'm taking frantic notes over here. I don't know about y'all. Do what you can. Reach out to me if you'd like, and I'll try to share you the best I can afterwards. Dr. Lechuga, you're up. Welcome. Thank you for coming, and let us know what you're working on right now.
Great. No, thank you for having me. I got to say again, thank you, Dr. Donaldson, for inviting me. Thank you, Rizzling Baldi and Dr. Calafell, for allowing me to, just even be in the same space as you all. I come kind of like Dr. Calafell from a lifelong love of sci-fi. I grew up an Alien film watcher, and then so aliens have sort of fascinated me. But the idea of aliens, especially as a mestizo growing up on the U.S.-Mexico border, from El Paso originally, so having the lived experience of mestizaje, border crossing, being in touch with the cultural otherness that goes along with mestizaje, but having sort of been detached from the Maya, Mexica, and other Mexican native heritages as a result of colonization, I think that now I can come full circle to see how my own draw towards the alien, especially being alien or at least wanting to be alien, has always been a part of me. So I guess in my 20 minutes, I'm going to talk about that notion of alienhood and how I sort of conceptualize alienhood from a settler colonial worldview, or at least a theoretical perspective that I'm sort of writing in my book. And then if I have a little bit of time, I'll talk about a new project I'm working on that engages with this idea of the time loop as a sort of like settler colonial trope of what I think has already been talked about, of constantly repeating the same sets of relations, so that way we have with us essentially the reproduction of the same relations that settler colonialism wants. The folks who are on top and those who are sort of exploited and whose lands and other things are exploited. So I wanted to share with you all, if you don't mind, my screen. I have a small graphic. I'm sorry, I never do PowerPoints, so this is all new to me. Okay. Oh, I started at the beginning. Oh, no. I'm looking at alienhood, and I think it's really important to bring up War of the Worlds. So, going counterclockwise, War of the Worlds was written in 1898, H.G. Wells, and it was written as, according to Wells, as a sort of like satire or an analogy of the British colonization of Tasmania. In fact, many of the accounts that you read in War of the Worlds about the kinds of destruction and the kinds of like annihilation of peoples were accounts that Wells read as a newspaper man from the British colonial, news wires. Fast forward to 1938, of course, Orson Welles then is doing the War of the Worlds via radio, which precedes World War II. An interesting, like, sort of imperial moment in U.S. history when the U.S. began its sort of like occupation of multiple parts of not only Europe, but then also Asia and Latin America. There's a film that come out about 15 years later, The War of the Worlds. Again, the same premise. The invading species comes with their tripods and tries to annihilate humanity. Fast forward again, you all know this face, Tom Cruise's 2005 version of Spielberg's War of the Worlds, which again sets the concept of alien invasion in a post 9/11 world where now alienhood is synonymous with terrorism. And then these last two examples on the right of the screen, or maybe your left of the screen. I never know when to zoom. Yeah, but we have two recent versions. 2020, there was two British versions of the War of the Worlds. The one on the bottom is set in turn of the century, 1900s England, and it sort of sticks really closely to the original War of the Worlds in its imagination. And then the top one is a sort of modern interpretation of the War of the Worlds. I'm saying all this to say the War of the Worlds represents for Wells not necessarily just an analogy, but in a book that he wrote in 1899, he talked about how science fiction and especially accounts of alien invasion are essentially preparations. It was called anticipations, and it was a science book for military use that warned of the potential of a colonization much akin to the colonizations that Britain was perpetuating around the world. And if Britain didn't prepare for these with highly advanced military and whatnot, then they would be subject to the same cruelty. Again, back to Dr. Rizzling-Baldi's point, the naturalization of colonialism in this perspective was palatable. He was literally saying the book that he wrote, War of the Worlds, was a narrative about what could be, putting it out there, simply mobilizing this like fear and anxiety around alien invasion, mobilized this violent, anxious response, not only from the readers, but then from listeners and viewers today. The War of the Worlds and this alien invasion genre, in fact, produce what I call an alienhood, an affect of alienhood, or an alien affect of anxiety, of fear, and for me, this is really the subject of why I'm writing my book. This is why I wanted to talk to you today. The idea of the production of an alien figure is, for me, a political subjection. So it's not only narrated through science fiction, but it also is a political discourse. It's in our policing protocol in the United States. It's part of our foreign policy in places like Mexico and Central America. So we can see that examples of the production of alienhood and the way that we talk about aliens from recent political examples, anywhere from Trump to Ronald Reagan, would describe folks from Mexico and Central America as aliens. In fact, the term that Reagan used in 1983 was super predator. And, you know, lo and behold, in 1987, the first film Predator comes out, set in Central America, that involves this invasive alien. You know, there's always a premise of invasion, and I think that what we talk about in terms of settler colonial invasion, it's clear that there's a correlation between the way that the alien invasion genre is imagined and the way that colonial invasion is imagined by the white narrators. They take the same shape. I'm looking at this alien invasion production, the narrative production from a settler colonial theory. And Lorenzo Veracini is the author of a book called Settler Colonialism, a Theoretical Orientation or Orientation Perspective, something like that. I'll definitely link that if folks are interested. But what I take away from there is this 4-part production model where settler colonialism relies on the production of settler sovereignty, which is like, I have a gun and I can do whatever I want to whatever person or whatever land is not white. And this idea of settler sovereignty is a holdover from like colonial sovereignty, in the sense that everything that is done and taken on behalf of the colonizing nation is for the sovereignty of that nation. What separates settler colonialism, though, is that settlers along the way decided to stop sending the checks back to the queen and keeping that for themselves, beginning to finance their own colonial projects, and eventually implementing their own governments, which were built around supporting the individual settler freedoms, right? This is why we have the Bill of Rights, which is the First and Second and Third Amendments, Fourth Amendments, which is like all things settlers can do, which the government can't like stop them from doing. This is really, for me, an expression of what settler sovereignty means. On top of that, you have the production of populations, which means settlers get to decide who's in and who's out of the settler club. Obviously, settlers are European, but they don't want to be identified as European, and so they do this act of nativizing themselves to this land that they stole. This act of nativization is also about like making native and indigenous peoples, mestizo peoples. And when I talk about native peoples, I'm also including native Africans who were essentially kidnapped and brought to this land. By managing those populations, settler colonists can continue to produce these sets of relationships where they can exploit lands and exploit peoples, right? The way that all this is disguised is through a narrative, a project of producing a narrative where the settler themselves is constantly the victim. And so Veracini talks about settler consciousness, which is part psychoanalytic, part narrative, and I think mostly built into a like rhetorical structure, something that we in communication studies study a lot about, like rhetorical frames. Well, I would actually argue that rhetorical framing is the way settler colonialism hides behind these ideas of victimization, nationalization, and the criminalization of bodies that are not white settlers. So with this sort of 4-part theory, I look at several examples in contemporary sci-fi. I'm looking at the Predator franchise, for example. Let me go to my next slide. The Predator franchise is one of those franchises that comes out during the Reagan administration that sort of like produces what you can see as like almost a nativized look, or the stylization of the body of a figure who represents invasion. And this figure, as we see in the production of multiple Predator films, is equipped with technology that they use to, hunt humans. What's interesting to me, and I think what's the topic of my book, is how many of these narrative structures, many of the narrative frames around invasion, also carry with them technologies that produce alienhood. So not only like special effects, but especially the CGI effects that go into creating a lot of these films. One example that I read about is how the front-looking infrared company FLIR Systems, who worked closely with the developers of the film, used a colorized camera in the second film. The first Predator film was shot in 1987, and FLIR Systems only had a black and white camera that they used for government and other sort of domestic surveillance kind of projects. Well, when the Predator film came out, the directors of the film needed a colorized infrared. They sent the images to a special effects team. The special effects team sent them back with color images that somebody had to like hand draw. Well, by the time the second Predator film came out, that same company incorporated those color schemes that were developed by Hollywood into their front-looking imagery, which by 2000 then were adopted by Department of Homeland Security, strapped onto no less a thing called a Predator drone, which flies over the US-Mexico border. So quite literally, the Predator film franchise had a hand in developing the technologies that are used on the US-Mexico border to surveil migrants. You can see some of these trends developing in other film franchises. Another one I look at is Men in Black. The film, which was released in 1996 or 1997, I believe, was released after Bill Clinton signed the 1996 immigration bill. I'm sorry, I lost my place in my, I'm going back and forth. Oh, it's called the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. This act essentially created a database tracking system and a removal process, which is now called ICE, right? Quite literally, a year after Bill Clinton signs this law, Hollywood imagines this clandestine government group who's responsible of like tracking illegal aliens through these networked of databases and then removing those who are considered threats, right? I don't think that it's a coincidence that many of the same technologies and many of the same imaginations that white settlers put into their extraterrestrial narratives are also finding themselves in like migrant policies and anti-migrant policies and border security policy in the US. The last thing I wanted to talk about then briefly was just time loops. I'm really fascinated with this idea of time loops now, and especially thinking about settler time. So Veracini and author Mark Rifkin write about like queering settler time and thinking about how we move away from a settler time that's individualized and ubiquitous, and thinking about anti-settler time would require us to think about the multiplicity of times that go into an experience. So for me, I think that this is a really rich area to start investing my attention. But when I started doing research on time loops, I'm finding that in the sci-fi alien genre, there's several time loops. And what was interesting to me also is that when we get down to it, time loops are basically just about returning to the moment where colonization is prime, where governments are unsteady, where there's no centralization of power, and where a white settler hero can use their violence and prowess to subjugate others to their will, right? Exactly like Captain Kirk in that scene, that you described a second ago, Dr. Baldi. But for me, that was a really telling moment, is to read how not only Rifkin but Berasini and others talk about this loop, and this return, or almost as like a palindromic loop, where settlers are constantly creating the conditions for upheaval. I'll just end by saying this is also really rooted in environmental upheaval. So settler colonialism is built on the extraction of like wealth from lands with the intention to create upheaval and then resulting in further violence, or in the case of like Elon Musk or others trying to go find somewhere else to colonize, right? This is a factor that's built into settler colonization that I'm trying to study, and really thinking through how it works with settler time in particular. So thank you all. That's all I wanted to say. And I want to again, thanks for the other panelists, especially for setting the stage for a great conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Lechuga. I really appreciate it. And thank you, all of the panelists, for your comments. One of the comments or the questions I wanted to start with was one of the ones that came in through the email, and it was geared towards Dr. Risling-Baldi, but I think we can kind of work towards some of the answers that we've gotten from some of these other folks. And the question is very, it's kind of straightforward. It asks, Dr. Risling-Baldi, could you share important themes or story elements from Indigenous futurities that differ in meaningful ways from settler colonial convention? Dr. Calafell, you talk about how monsters are made and how there's that possibility there at that moment. And I'm sure that there's, possibly thematic constructions there that maybe you might want to comment on. Dr. Lechuga, I'll let you kind of chew on this in terms of alienhood and the construction of alienhood. Dr. Risling-Baldi, would you like to take a crack at that?
I think one thing I would say is like indigenous futurisms and futurities is sort of looking at how we build a future with a past, because our connection to land, to space, is so long that we think about this as all connected I think what Rifkin also talks about is sort of like beyond time. So what we say from where we are, we always say like, we've been in this place for time immemorial. And what that actually means is like beyond time, beyond time's existence, with before time even comes into being, we've been here, right? And then to kind of think about how we've always conceptualized our connections sort of beyond time, and building with like this very long space. So I think our futurism is really tied to like, this is an unbroken connection between our past and our future. And that there's the disruption of settler colonialism, but we never say like that disruption caused an end. That it's not an end. It's like a new beginning. It's a new place, but we're continuing from like our past. I also think that it offers us an opportunity to kind of really engage with place in a really connective way. So so when we start imagining like going into, and I think indigenous peoples are some of the first peoples who were imagining like thinking about space and the stars and like moving into new directions and what that means to like theorize, but always within the context of like how you understand your responsibility to that and the connections to that, and then what it means for like the space that we exist in here on this planet. And what I always found really interesting about even like the ways in which we understood language. Oh, this is what I always thought was funny. I always say to people, our languages were made like foreign to our own lands. Our languages were made like to be some kind of like primitive way of thinking. We're always made sort of othered through our languages. Like when we use them, they try to sort of other our language in our own space. And when you confront people with indigenous languages in text, in movies, in wherever, they act as if it's something so different, so alien to this place. And yet it is like English that is alien to this place. It's English that's not indigenous to the places that we exist. So in my mind, it's like trying to kind of bring like indigenous peoples and indigenous futurities is trying to say, how do we reconnect the fact that like we are the people of this place, the knowledge of this place, our languages of this place, and then how we are made alien in our own place, right? And then how we sort of identify to that. We identify to that in all the spaces that we're watching sort of science fiction things, and the ways in which the other is being treated by people. And I always thought it was funny because when I give students readings and stuff, I'll come back and I'll say, how many of you took the time to try to pronounce the indigenous words, the indigenous names, the indigenous places that were in this reading? And they'll be like, oh, I skipped over it. There's no way to figure it out. And I'll be like, well, Google is like a thing, right? You should Google it and look it up. But at the same time, I always say to them, look, if we can all correct each other on the proper ways to say names from Star Wars, or like if we all like can figure out phrases that you're supposed to say in Dothraki, we can learn how to say indigenous names for things. Like I think it kind of opens up people's ideas about like, what does it mean that like these kinds of ways in which we engage with our pop culture kind of demonstrate what we do when we other people's space. So I think it offers kind of those like long-standing connections that are really important.
Dr. Calafell, you want to jump in on that?
Can you repeat the question for me, please?
Yeah, it was just about, so the question for Risling-Baldi, Dr. Risling-Baldi, was about like what kind of themes that we see in, like indigenous futurities that maybe differ from like the settler colonial frame. And so I guess in the language of monstrosity, it would be like, what, are there thematic components of monstrosity? You've spoken in your book about shapeshifting, for instance, like in particular that are places of, potential or possibility that you see?
Oh, yeah, for sure, definitely. And I think that's the one thing that I got most from the Gloria Anzaldúa archive. When we hear about Gloria Anzaldúa, for example, people don't necessarily think about monsters or aliens, and she's written about both. And that's one of the things that I found fascinating when I was there, is how she talked about her own body, and the way that her body had been labeled as sick right? And the ways that she used monsters as a way to connect to a pre-colonial past, as well as connect to her own space of possibility and a resistance, right? And her own queerness. And it's funny too, because one of the things I was thinking about with what Gloria Anzaldúa, and then when Dr. Lechuga was talking as well, is one of the things that Anzaldúa does in her work is she really queers time, right? And so I'm really interested too in what you're saying too as well about the possibility of time and queerness. And there's been some really interesting work around and I come to it from a Chicana feminist perspective around queer temporality, right? So what does it mean for us to think about as queer folks to disrupt this temporality? This temporality was not made for us, right? And especially for those of us who are queer people of color, being Chicana, what does it mean to think about thinking about the pre-colonial and the decolonial, right, in terms of temporality, right? So I don't know if that really gets at the question, but I am totally into what we're talking about. And I'm editing a book right now with Dr. Santosh Chandrasekhar on settler colonialism studies in communication. And so I feel like now we need to add a chapter about monsters in settler colonialism or something like that, because this conversation is just wonderful. So thank you all for the inspiration.
Yeah, can I add one thing too that I always thought was really fascinating? When you're talking about monsters and settler colonialism, so I do all this work with zombies, right? And I'm like always talking about like what's a zombie and like how does it function, the historical things. If you've never read the history of zombies, everybody should read like the history of zombies and like how this happens, because it really does come from communities of color, this conversation, and then gets sort of taken over. But there's this, as I was doing these talks based on this Walking Dead blog, which I always said that thing went so viral that like uh it got translated into like Swahili and Turkish and French and like all these things where people were like, what? Like The Walking Dead is about California Indians? And I was like, yep. But as I was doing these talks, this person came up to me one time and they said, did you ever think about how when the Spanish conquistadors came over on the boat to California, this is like, they hadn't figured out yet they're supposed to like eat lemons and stuff. So they like are all getting scurvy and they look horrible and they're starving. Their teeth are falling out. Their skin's like hanging off. They have no hair because they're all like just coming off this boat. They're like, and they would walk off and they'd be like, we are here to trade with you or whatever. And of course, like Indians are looking at them like, oh my God, it's a zombie. It's like an actual like living Walking Dead. There's something wrong with these people. And then in San Diego, one of the things that happened is they land and they get off this boat and they all die within like a couple weeks. And then they all bury them in the ground, like in this one part of San Diego, they call it Dead Man's Point, right? Because they had buried a bunch of Spanish soldiers there who just died once they got off the boat. And I was like, oh my God, it was a zombie invasion. It was like an invasion of monsters. And they're watching this happen. And then what did we do with it? They built a cheesecake factory on top of it. So they actually built a cheesecake factory on top of Dead Man's Point. And I was like, that to me is just hilarious. But at the top of it, I was like, it was a monster invasion. They were being invaded by zombies, is what they were being invaded by.
And I will add too, one of the things that we don't always think about is Get Out as a zombie film and how that is connected to large, rich traditions around zombies in Haitian culture as well. And I'm going to shut up now so other people can talk.
No, and I'm thinking about like how they probably walked funny when they got off the boats because they were like, in a boat for however long. But one thing that I wanted to add onto what both of you commented was the idea of reconnection, right? It's not that like connection had been severed and now it's like you have to restart something. And I think about indigenous erasure. I recently did a talk about how universities participate in Native and indigenous erasure through like the land grant process and through sort of the spirit of the land grant in the way that it creates a singular sort of epistemology, the singular verse of the university. And other scholars, of course, I'm thinking about like Walter Mignolo, Catherine Walsh, Nina Pacari, talk about how we move away from that model of the university to the pluriversity. Anyway, I wanted to also comment about this idea of reconnection, because it seems to me like there's an important way to imagine a future that is, like I think Dr. Risling-Baldi said, connected to a past, but that imagines a future through even like practices of naming, right? I was living in Minneapolis when they changed Lake Calhoun to Lake de Makaska, which was its native Anishinaabe name. But then, like, they named it Calhoun again because some state said, no, you don't have the authority to name or some state like entity said, you don't have the authority. We have the authority to name the lake. And then some federal court came back and said, actually, no, they do have the authority to name the lake. And so, again, right, this idea of like naming, but then who has the authority to do the naming? Who maintains that authority? And those practices of authorization, or even when it comes to like, citizenship, those processes of documentation, which have become, I think, a sort of colonial legacy. So maybe my vision of a future free of settler colonialism would be like free of documentation, free of the necessity of administrations and authorities and whatnot. I also want to say briefly, like, there's a scholar, Eric Torrico, who's a Bolivian scholar, who writes about the 5 communications of colonization. The first being what he describes as like pre-colonial communication. And then the second, which I'm most interested is the communication of incommunicable, or rendering somebody incommunicable. The one thing that we study in our field is precisely how we use communication as a good thing, or as a way to like bring people together, as a way to like build bridges between groups. And I think that we understudy just how important communication is in rendering not only people, but also lands, air, water, animals incommunicable to us, right? We have this standard. So, Dr. Risling-Baldi, when you talked about the Spanish rolling up, like only speaking Spanish to try to get like native Californians to communicate with them. Well, yeah, it was a matter of not being communicable enough to these groups, and that is the first process in the dehumanization of the other, is rendering them incommunicable. So I think that a future that rejects settler colonialism would reconnect not only to native languages, but the authorities and the sovereignties given to people to live in their own language, in their own time, in their own space, without having to account for what other people are doing in their times and spaces and whatnot.
Really appreciate all of that. I think that the next question I want to get to is a little more general, but I would really love to get your response on it. And it came from a student, and the question is like, what would you tell students that are suspicious of claims that you have to do a whole lot of reading to understand critical theory? This in particular is not coming from a fragile space. It's coming from a space that's just very suspicious of academia, and it feels like academia itself kind of colonizes our imagination, and the notion that we have to read all these books is itself kind of inherently colonial. So I'm wondering if anyone would like to volunteer to just kind of grapple with that one.
I'll
Dr.
weigh in
Calafell?
for a second. Sure. I mean, for me, I think one of the reasons why I'm committed to a feminist politics is because it honors the politics and the knowledge that come from the body, right? And, so much of what we see in academia ignores the body and lived experience, right? Or theorizing through lived experience. And so for me, that idea that the knowledge that could come from the theory in the flesh, which is what Moraga and Anzaldúa term it, being important was revolutionary to me. And so the fact that we could theorize through the everyday, we can intellectualize through the everyday, what Patricia Hill Collins talks about, is revolutionary, right? And so I think for me, coming to academia, my goal was to disrupt the notion of the theory needs to look a certain way, right? Or that I have to cite these certain people to succeed. And so I'm very much interested in the idea of disruption through citation and the politics of citation. And part of the work that I do around sci-fi, or mostly horror, also deals with bringing my body into the space, right? And I do that through critical qualitative work, right? And so one of the things I've written about is for example, how women of color in academia are constructed through the lens of monstrosity, right? And so, I wrote this paper about, women of color, werewolves, monstrosity in academia, and I'm thinking that it's not going to fly. Well, it got published, so how can we start to make small steps toward changing what the academy looks like instead of us having to always bow down to the canon, right? And so that's kind of my approach to that the body and centering the body knowledge that has often been where people of color have theorized because of histories of oppression is just as important. And that for me is very much tied into a critical race and feminist perspective.
Having benefited from reading that article in the class that you taught, Dr. Calafell, I'll just say that it spoke to a lot of people. A lot of people like saw themselves in that article, and it speaks to just the power too of that presence. It's like once you get through that door, then you can create a basin where a bunch of people are going to come to communicate similar concepts and things. Dr. Lechuga, did you want to get in there?
Yeah, I have a colleague, and I got to know this colleague's partner. His name is Eleuterio, and he participated. Well, they both participated in, I guess, some of the civil rights activism in Puerto Rico in the 60s and 70s. So one of the things he mentioned to me was like, yeah, everybody loves being revolutionary, but what happens when we need to build schools after the revolution? Everybody seems to like run away and just want to build more revolutions instead of build schools to like start something new, to create something new. So I agree 100% with Dr. Calafell. Like the something new that needs to be created, it isn't going to come from, I think, traditions or places that have always been read in the classics, right? Wasn't it Howard that just got rid of their classics program and took a bunch of heat for it, right? And I think that like getting rid of the classics is great for building. Now, I'm going to say this, and it might be controversial, but I am actually somebody who says we probably do also need to read the critical theory or the tradition. And I use this metaphor with my class a lot. I'm teaching a class on critical cultural decolonial studies. And those revolutionaries are talented at destruction, at destroying, at decolonizing, undoing the structures of settler colonialism. And I think that that's a really important process. So, the Death Star, they didn't throw like photons at the Death Star from the planet. No, they actually studied the plans of the Death Star. They saw how the Death Star was assembled. They saw, like, they took the plans and they took the time to understand exactly the precise places where to strike the Death Star so that the rebel force would be able to take down the Death Star. And I think that so much of that metaphor is part of my work in not only thinking about my responsibility as a mestizo in building new communities and in building communities that are beyond settler colonialism, but my responsibility as a mestizo in the processes of settler colonialism. So if I can do my part to share the plans with people so that they can pinpoint the place where they can, shoot the photon laser and use the force and whatnot to destroy the Death Star that is contemporary hypercapitalism, colonialism, settler, patriarchy, then yeah, I think that it is okay, and it's important for folks who want to do that kind of work.
I will say, I think it is important, and I was on a panel a few years ago at NCA about should we study the canon still in rhetorical theory, and all the women said no, and all the men said yes. And I think there's something interesting as well around gender in the body. So I don't know, just my 2 cents.
I agree. Knowing the canon definitely preserves the status quo. And I think that you mentioned, right, like having to cite certain people. But I also think about like Wayne Yang's work. Wayne Yang, as a pseudonym, is La Pepper's son, who wrote The Third University is Possible. And they talk about trafficking technologies. And I think that like, if we think about using critical scholarship as a technology for the purposes of like destroying the structures of it, then I'm all for it. And I really like that idea that we can traffic the same technologies that are often used for, subversion of peoples or the subjection of peoples to then turn them back on folks, right? I like, for example, you were talking about Dr. Rizzling-Baldi, indigenous comic books, right? And so we're using a colonial technology of storytelling that gets purposed and trafficked essentially to do the, hopefully the opposite, is to tell stories that are not dominant stories. And I think that, you know, for me, at least in critical theory, that's one way to leverage that.
Can you repeat the question one more time, just because I want to make sure that my answer fits what the question is?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to try to figure out if I even remember. We were talking about reading, and we were talking about the relationship that a lot of students have is feeling very alienated with reading in general, and with like the canon and the so-called canon in particular, right? Like, how do you respond to students that feel that way, that feel like reading itself separates them from learning, or that reading particular material maybe does so?
Though I'll say this, I got my MFA in creative writing, and then I got my PhD later. But I'll say this: the Western canon is bunk. And if you never read a single thing from the Western canon, it's fine. It'll never affect you again. If you came to me tomorrow and was like, I've never read a single word of Shakespeare, I'd be like, oh no, what are we gonna do? There's so much other stuff to read. Cool. Also, I always tell people I've figured out a couple of really cool things. One, you don't ever have to read Ernest Hemingway, the novelist. Don't let them convince you that any of his novels are worth reading. They're really long and meandering because he was very drunk when he wrote them. He's a great short story writer. You should read his short stories. Brevity is his friend, right? But they never tell you those kinds of things. They act like he has a lot of good insight. The Western canon was set up to give you insight into like white male points of view on the world as if that's normal. And everything else is kind of like othered to the white male point of view. It's why they tell you you have to read The Great Gatsby and know why there's a green light at the end of the stupid dock. And then that's going to change your life somehow. It's not. You can read all kinds of things. I always say to people, throw out the Western canon if you want to, but read all the time. Find the voices that like sustain you and build you and help you, because they are out there. They're not going to give them to you yet in a high school classroom, because they're trying to teach you a logics of settler colonialism. They're trying to teach you how to sort of like internalize these ideas as if they could only be the only way we express a world. So I went to a great lecture where this woman was like, you know, people have an easier time of imagining what they're going to do in a zombie apocalypse than they do imagining the end of capitalism. And the reason is that we are never given the tools through our Western canon to imagine that. We actually only learn about how this system is the only thing that exists and makes sense. So there are people that have done that. Find them, read them, pass them around to people. Insist that those are the classes that you take. Take all the classes in ethnic studies. Take all the classes in Native American studies. It is there for you. If you are taking classes where they're only teaching you Western canon materials, then you are taking the wrong classes. You should take different classes because they are out there. They are being taught. I will tell you this. When I went to Stanford when I was an undergraduate. I took like, they made us take like a literature classics course in our first year as a freshman. Both of those courses taught the Symposium by Plato. So I had to actually read that twice in the same year. And I was like, why is there nobody else that's ever written about love in the history of the world that we could read? Oh, but you gotta know how Plato felt about love in order to understand anything that you're going to do. And I was like, actually, the only thing I'm internalizing from this book is that we took a pedophile's manifesto about why he likes little boys and made it into a classic. And now we study it and justify it by saying it was a man of his time kind of thing, when I guarantee you there were people at the time that were like, that guy's a weirdo who likes little boys. And then he wrote a whole book about it where his whole thing in his book is, I like little boys. Then that's the only kind of love that matters. And we weren't allowed to say that in class. Our professor got very upset when we were like, what? And he was like, you don't get it. You don't understand. So they're like always policing how you envision or understand roles in the world. But there are people who have already gone beyond that. when you read them, you'll start to see they've imagined worlds without prisons. They've imagined worlds without peoples that are being held in cages at borders. We have right now a situation where we are like kids are dying in cages at the border right now. And then people act like that's somehow a policy issue, and then that becomes that discussion. And yet you can read these stories about what that really means. So like find them, insist on it. And then if a person tells you in this class we're only going to read the 5 standard books that you had to read ever since you were like in high school, to take a different class. They're behind. It's time to just be like, nah, I don't have to deal with that anymore, because we are out there trying to do that. We can give you all kinds of lists. I will tell you, I highly think if you never read a white male talking about how upset he is about his relationship with his wife, or how some woman rejected him and he could never get over it, you're going to be okay. There's so many other things to read than that. So like find it, read it, do it. Don't think that when I say don't read the Western canon, it means don't read. Read all the time. Read all the time, because they're out there like waiting for you to find them.
Yeah, I tell students I had to become a reader. It took time for me to become one, and I had to make choices about making space for it, and material had a lot to do with it, and the care for the material really mattered. I really appreciate all of that. The next question is pretty simple, but I hope it has, some really great answers that walk us towards, that 8:30 mark here. The question is just, what is so important about horror and science fiction? I think we've talked a little bit about this, but it's just, kind of the critic in the room, that it's like, why these two particular fields? Like, why would we look at these two particular genres? And as the person that set it up, like, the only thing that I would throw into the mix here is just very much because it is about constructions of otherness in the future. To me, is kind of like where my interests have been as a debate coach. Otherness is a big thing, and what are we going to do about it, and what's next is typically what we're arguing about. And so that's always been my kind of interest. But I'm curious if any of you would just like to take a quick shot at why science fiction or horror are so important from a critical standpoint.
I'll start, and I think it's something that Dr. Risling-Baldi already mentioned, and Dr. Calafell pointed to, was that for many of us, we already live in dystopia, or we already live in a horror film. We already live and have epigenetic legacies and histories of peoples who have experiences of running away from killers, of being like removed from your land, being chased away, and these anxieties, I think, for many people are realities. I think that I come to science fiction and monstrosity simply because it's like lived experiences for many people that's sort of translated and in many ways usurped by white culture to like share their anxieties by erasing the bodies. It's just like Mexican food. Like, it's all the enjoyment of what it is, but without the people.
I would say that it is important and interesting to study monstrosity and horror in particular. And I'll reference two pieces that I think are important. I would look at the book Monsters in America, which takes a historical approach to the study of monsters. And the argument that is important is that the monsters are a mirror to our society, right? The monsters reflect our cultural, social, political, economic anxieties and racial anxieties. So for me, if we want to study what is happening in our society, we need to look at the monsters that animate our society, right? And if you're interested in some of that relationship, one of the books I would recommend is by Kendall Phillips on I believe it's called like The Rhetoric of Horror or something like that. But that's, for me, is why I think horror is interesting. And right now we're in a horror renaissance, and we're coming up against all of this kind of, we transitioned from a post 9/11 torture porn era to now the horror of the Trump era, right? Which is a whole new thing. And so for me, horror has become a place for people to work through these cultural anxieties, as well as them to be reflected back to the culture. So that's kind of why I think it's important that it's a genre that is easily dismissed, but a genre that is very telling about a society.
I think what I'll say about science fiction is and this is something that I have said in multiple spaces about like what it means to build radical imagination. I will say this, in an indigenous context, nothing can become until you story it into being. And everything begins with a story. It begins with you telling a story about what it could be or what it is or what you envision it. And until you do that, it can't become. So we have these spaces through like science fiction and futurisms where we can start to story into being all the different things that we want to see happening, all the ways that we can understand it, all the ways that we can engage in it. I always sort of point out like, you know, one day some guy was sitting around with his friends and he was like, you know what we should do is like invent a website where people take pictures and then they post them up and then other people like them. And then sometimes it's of their food. And then people talk about, where'd you get that food? And then his friends were like, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Also, what are you talking about? And then he's like, no, I'm just thinking out loud, right? And then suddenly Instagram comes into being and now he's a freaking billionaire. So I feel like us telling stories is a way of us to kind of bring into being all of the different things, and we can't do that collectively until we just start telling stories. And that's, I think, why in indigenous cultures there was such a revered role for storytellers, because it was the space of imagination. It was the space of like understanding who we are, who we could be, where we came from, where we were going, and in ways that allowed us to have really deep and meaningful conversations. Science fiction, think about it, like it builds really deep and meaningful conversations about, is that a good idea, right? I can't tell you how many times I will meet with like scientists and stuff, and I'll be like, hey man, I'm having some Jurassic Park flashbacks here in terms of how you're talking about this. Like, let's think about this in the context of what went on. You think you're in control of this situation. Here comes the T-Rex. Like, I feel like it gives you a context of being able to kind of say, we've worked through the possibilities. We've seen it happen. Now, what does that mean for the kinds of decisions we want to make, and the way and the information that we want to like carry forward? And I think that that's the beautiful thing about it. That comes from the storytelling and the sort of like the liberating of your imagination in that way.
Well, I really appreciate all of your time. I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll wrap it up. And it's purely a selfish one. What are you reading right now? Like, what would you recommend for the audience, whether we're interested in this particular stuff or just in general? Like, what are you reading that is just turning the pages by itself for you right now? Is there anyone that'd like to take that one on?
Well, I love Jose Esteban Munoz, and so his Sense of Brown book is what I've been reading, as well as Jackie Cueva's book on post-Borderlandia is something I've been reading. I've got a list of books actually that I'm waiting to read this summer, but those are the two that I will throw out for my, and they're not necessarily related to this project, but they're important books that folks might want to take a look at.
I named mine. I just finished Parable of the Sower. I'm in the midst of Parable of the Talents. I'm about to read the last in that series, post that. It is eerily on point in terms of the predictions that are in that book, where the president's slogan is "Make America Great Again." And I think that it's really telling that it was a Black feminist writer that was talking about what this means, what this looks like, especially in the context of what's happening right now with Black Lives Matter, what's happening right now with like on the ground things that are happening to people and the ways in which we see that going on. And then I also just picked up a book by Stephen Graham Jones, who's an incredible sort of like speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy, indigenous writer. And his new book is called The Only Good Indian. He also, like, I just picked that one up, so I'll start that one just as soon as I refinish Octavia Butler's work. And he wrote a really good book called Mongrels, which is about werewolves, and indigenous werewolves. So I feel like I'm looking forward to what he has to say. And then I just refinished Blake Houseman's book On the Trail of Tears, I think it's called. this is an amazing book, a science fiction book about, it's kind of like Westworld. It's like this ride that they invent so that people can relive the Trail of Tears. And it's all about like all the white people that come to like want to live the Trail of Tears, and this Cherokee woman who guides them on the Trail of Tears as they're reliving it in this virtual reality. And the little people, the Cherokee little people who are like their trickster figures, get mad about it. And so they start messing with the ride. And it's a really good sort of discussion about like wanting to relive settler colonialism in this kind of safe context, and then what happens when the tricksters get involved. So I would recommend, I just finished that one like right before I started Octavia Butler's work again.
Wow, I wish I could read right now. Unfortunately, with my grad seminar, I will say that my partner recommended, and we've just picked up Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And I'm interested particularly in this idea of like the way that we talk about science and the way that we talk about the environment from a settler perspective. And for fun, I've been really delving into this book. I try to spend as much time as I can outside now, and I, see which birds are in my neighborhood.
Well, we're on time. I just wanted to say again, thank you to our 3 distinguished scholars for taking the time to be with us tonight and sharing this work. I really appreciate y'all. Thanks again to the folks that were able to help us make this happen. It takes a lot of work and a lot of patience and a lot of kind of back and forth email wise. So thanks to all the folks that I named at the top for helping me out. Everyone, thanks for coming. Really appreciate y'all. Take care of each other. Take care of yourselves. Be well. Thanks, everybody. Good night.